Welcome back. A full symphonic orchestra can be made up of over 100 musicians, yet it has been a rare occasion when any major orchestra has consisted of any more than a handful of black musicians. Oboist Harry Smyles recalls an experience he had with Dimitri Mitropoulos, who served as music director with the New York Philharmonic from 1949 to 1958. After writing to the conductor about an opening for an oboe player the symphony was looking to fill, Smyles was invited to a private audition with Mitropoulos in his home.
He lived in a penthouse in the Great Northern Hotel on 57th Street. And I went there, and he was a very, very gracious man. He sat down at the piano, and he accompanied me in a Handel concerto. And when we got through, he told me, he said, I just came back from Europe, and I didn't hear as fine a sound as you have in Europe. I said, you play very well. He said, you haven't gotten a job anywhere yet? And he said, why don't you go down south and try one of the southern orchestras? I imagine that would be where most of your people are, you know.
Still, Mitropoulos assured Smyles he would be invited to an upcoming audition, and that if he played as well as any other who auditioned, he would get the job.
And I waited. I went home, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. Then I was talking to someone over the phone, and he said, did you hear about the auditions? And I said, what auditions? He said, the Philharmonic just had auditions for assistant first oboe. And Bob Lerman got the job.
Frustrated by the lack of opportunities for minorities, an interracial group of musicians founded the Symphony of the New World in 1964. It was the first professional, totally integrated symphonic orchestra in the United States. With Benjamin Steinberg as music director, the orchestra set out to meet its goals.
Our aim was to show the whole world that there were a great number of black musicians who were very well schooled, highly trained, and very talented, in which I think we did that.
Towards the end of the symphony's lifetime, it had a black conductor when Everett Lee took on that role in 1973. A black conductor was virtually unheard of.
There were various musicians who left the symphony. That's why it was almost self-defeating for us to do what we were doing, because we were going to lose people along the way as they went into the mainstream orchestras.
If it had had more financial backing, that's what it really needed, financial backing, and it needed leadership courage of their convictions. I think Ben Steinberg, who founded it, in some ways perhaps wasn't the greatest conductor. He was a good conductor. First, you know, he could do a good job of anything, and perhaps some of the people who came on as guests or who came on as a subsequent, like Everett Lee, who was a very, very wonderful conductor and certainly deserved to be the musical director, but Ben was kind of pushed aside, and Ben had the know-how to raise money, and that is also very important. The symphony orchestra is it's a business, it's very complicated, and it needs financial support.
Inadequate funding was an ongoing problem, so community support was vital to the orchestra's existence. No one spent more time raising funds to keep the orchestra alive than did Clarissa Cumbo, wife of cellist Marion Cumbo.
She appreciated Marion, and she made it possible for Marion to devote most of his life to musical performance. They were very, very important people because they also created triad presentations. They were among the founders of the Symphony of the New World, but they created a producing organization, and they did it on a shoestring. They did without a lot of comfort, creature comforts, to do what they did, to produce concerts downtown and uptown, but basically they gave debuts or important appearances to people downtown. Clarissa would manage the concert for people.
Their home was often the center of activity for an organization to aid the orchestra that Clarissa helped create, Friends of the Symphony of the New World. It has been described as a near shrine with photographs and mementos of the black musical artists who had been a part of their lives. Both Marion and Clarissa are deceased, but fortunately for the rest of us, their extensive collection of memorabilia has been donated to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York City. That concludes part 1 of Classically Black, our special edition of Another View. Join us again next week for part 2 from several black musicians, past and present, about their experiences in classical music. For Another View, I'm Karen Smyles. Welcome to part 2 of Classically Black, a special presentation of Another View. I'm Karen Smyles. Musicians of African descent have made and still make tremendous contributions to the world of classical music. This fact is not commonly known, but there have been several men and women who have earned their places among the greatest in musical history. Last week, we discussed some of the artists from as early on as the 18th century, and in this program, we'll share the personal experiences of the pioneers of this century. It has been an ongoing struggle for black musicians to cross over into the mainstream of major symphonic orchestras. Training from the finest music schools and conservatories in the world and international rave reviews have proven to be of little in trying to break racial barriers. In 1962, the New York Philharmonic hired its first black member, violinist Sanford Allen.
One of the things that led to my auditioning for the Philharmonic was the fact that the Urban League, somewhere in the late 50s, I'm hedging a bit because I no longer remember the date, did a study on the relationship of black musicians to symphonic music and discovered that there was no relationship. Yeah. And then they began badgering people to at least agree to allow black players to audition. You see, because, for example, in the 50s, you see, now when the Philharmonic holds auditions, those auditions are listed in the union paper so that everybody knows. In the 50s, they weren't. What happened was that there was word of mouth. So if you studied with someone who played in the New York Philharmonic, you heard about the audition. If you didn't, you didn't. And since there weren't any black players studying with anybody who played in the New York Philharmonic at that time, consequently, they never knew that there was an audition.
But Sanford Allen's breakthrough did not have much of an impact on further integrating the orchestra. The Philharmonic and one of history's most famous conductors, Leonard Bernstein, were at the center of a discrimination case in 1969.
Information on each person, and each person was given a number. And I understand that they even got so good at that after a while, if they wanted a certain person to get the job, They had certain signals or something that they, but by and large, it's supposed to be a colorblind audition.
Leonard Bernstein, who also served as music director of the New York Philharmonic from 1958 to 1969, disagreed with this method of auditioning because he said he really needed to see the person playing.
Well, I disagree with him in that I think preliminary auditions could be that way. Whoever is chosen to finally, say the finalists, then should be out in the open. But certainly, for instance, the two black musicians who sued the Philharmonic, and they were really suing Leonard Bernstein in a way, Leonard Bernstein at the hearing said that the only reason they were in the finals of their auditions was that he had put them there because they were black and that they didn't go through the regular routine.
He was a unique individual, terribly self-centered, Leonard Bernstein, marvelously self-centered, with the kind of ego that Jimmy Levine has. Also, they have a one-track mind and they think only, it's got to come from them. You can't ask them for anything because then you're not going to get it. They like to discover and do their own discovering and their own tinkering with the with people's lives, but on their own terms. And I think perhaps he has been greater maligned than in that, along those lines, than he should be. I don't think Lenny really gave much thought to the question of race at all. I really don't. I think he was just too much in this special world, which was the world of Lenny Bernstein.
In 1995, the New York Philharmonic again had but one black musician, principal hornist Jerome Ashby. Personally, he has had very few incidents of discrimination and credits earlier musicians like Sanford Allen.
I know that when I first came to the Philharmonic, being the only African-American member, many of the conductors that passed by were sort of surprised to see me sitting in the first horn chair, but I think it was just a question of proving myself, and I get along fine with all the conductors that pass through New York.
How do you feel when people focus so much attention on your race?
Well, I wish that it didn't take place, that I didn't have to think about that, but it does, and I have to deal with it accordingly.
Almost every other category you can think of has had a huge turnover. I mean, for example, the viola section is almost entirely women. The flute section, I believe, is entirely women. There are women in every segment of the orchestra, which is fine. There are lots of Russian emigres. There are lots of Asians of various origins. But somehow or other, that's the only group that hasn't changed. It's the black contingent. The only sort of vague note of progress, I suppose, would be that Jerome is a solo player.
Also in 1995, the Philadelphia Orchestra had 3 African-American musicians, an impressive number when compared to others.
There were people that said, aha, Eugene Ormandy doesn't want black musicians in the Philadelphia Orchestra. My dream was always to play in the Philadelphia Orchestra. But people would say, I don't know, Eugene Ormandy has no blacks in the orchestra. So I always worried, well, gee, maybe they're right, maybe I can't make it, but I was determined.
Are people surprised to learn that you're a musician with one of the best orchestras in the world?
No, I think people now are, they expect that more orchestras would take more blacks, and I think blacks, we are becoming more accomplished too, and we have more opportunities, and we're doing good. So I think it's not a question of being surprised or anything. It's accepting it and being happy about it.
When you consider the fact that For example, the Philadelphia Orchestra, which resisted a lot longer, actually wound up with more black players. It would seem to indicate that there is more than one black musician on the Eastern Seaboard who was qualified to play in a major orchestra.
When Classically Black continues, we'll meet more of this century's talented musicians.